In this video, I'm going to tell you about why I'm not interested in buying a Resin 3D printer. Yet. Just up front, this is all my opinion, and I just want to make this video because I've had a lot of people ask me about Resin 3D printing, both when I'm going to get into it, because I've done a video in the past about 3D printing and didn't really talk about resin. You can watch that video up here. Pachow. And also I've had a lot of people ask me, because they just want to know more about 3D printing, and they've asked me because I've done that previous video, to which I just pachowed. So yeah, this stuff is my opinion. I'm not saying that 3D printing is bad, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with it, I'm just kind of talking about how it's kind of seeming to me at this point. So I've had several companies reach out to me recently. The three big ones I can think of off the top of my head are Anycubic, which is the company that makes like the Anycubic Photon and the Anycubic Photon S. Elegoo, who makes the Elegoo Mars, and another company called Geeetech, because there's like a lot of E's in that word. It's not just like one or two, it's I think maybe three or four. All three of them, and a couple others I can't think of off the top of my head, have reached out to me through my business YouTube channel thing and said, or email, and said, hey, we'd like to send you a printer and make a video about it and all that kind of stuff and whatnot. And I've told them all, no thank you. And the reason for that is because I'm not currently prepared to own a resin printer. A Resin 3D printer. So for those of you that don't know what Resin 3D printers are, I'm going to try to give you a real big quick overview. Right now there are two main types of home 3D printers. There's the filament style printer, which is the type of printer I mostly talked about in that previous video, and it's basically like a big spool of plastic, and kind of like how when you press a glue stick and it melts it and pushes it through the little nozzle and then you squirt it all over the place and burn your hands with it. This is like that, except that it's not glue, it's kind of a plastic. Sometimes it's ABS, sometimes it's PLA. There's other things you can print with as well that also have acronyms, I'm sure. And that stuff gets fed through a little tinier nozzle, and hopefully it doesn't burn you, because you shouldn't have your hands in the 3D printer when it's going, because it's kind of like a robot. It's basically drawing layer after layer of the thing that you're printing from the bottom up generally. And then when it's all done, and it can take hours and hours and hours and hours. When it's all done, then you knock it off of the plate in some fashion, like a putty knife or whatever, and then you have this thing. You've probably all seen 3D printed filament stuff. Very frequently, unless you really spend a ton of time tweaking and sanding and stuff like that, you'll see the little telltale kind of striation lines of each layer as it prints. I do own a filament 3D printer, which I use for terrain from time to time, and it works out nicely for that kind of stuff. Now, resin printers, when I first did that original video, resin printers were a good deal more expensive. Now they have dropped drastically in price, as most tech things have a tendency to do over time. But resin 3D printers work differently. Number one, they work upside down. So instead of basically having a little robot hand thing draw with layers of plastic on a plate and work its way up, what happens is the plate goes down into this vat of liquid resin, which is photoreactive, meaning that UV light makes it get harder. So what happens is either, and it depends on the type of resin printer you get, there's the type that uses lasers, and then it draws every single slice. If you take the 3D object, you have to put it in this program first called a slicer. You need that for filament machines as well. And what it does is it figures out how to take the thing that you want to print and break it up into every single slice that it needs to do to make the entire thing. So that's already been done before you start printing. So it basically draws every slice on the underside of the plate, which is down inside of the fluid. The bottom of the vat is clear, so lasers can get through. And then it basically kind of makes a little copy, and then the plate that goes down inside there just moves up just microscopically, and then it does the next one, and then microscopically, and the next one. The other type of resin printer doesn't use lasers, and these are the ones that are generally cheaper. Instead, it uses an LCD screen. So it basically shows an image of each slice. The light underneath, instead of being the normal light that you look on your cell phone, is actually a UV light, and so that cures each slice, and then again, slowly over time, this thing gets pulled out of the goop until the entire thing is finished. Now, when I'm talking about microscopically, that's where the resin printers come in handy, is that they basically, every single slice is so tiny that you can almost barely see them. If you look at a resin print of an object and a filament print of an object, it is very difficult to make the filament print look more detailed and less liney, for lack of a better term, than a resin print. So you're thinking to yourself, well, heck, you know, Uncle Adam, we're dealing in generally small things here in our hobby, miniatures, hence the name. Well, why not just stick with a resin printer? Why not get yourself a resin printer? They've come down considerably in price. I can find resin printers on Amazon for $250. So what's the problem? For me, one of the biggest problems, it's the smell. Sorry, I got a little bit of Agent Smith from the Matrix there. But the resin, most of the resins that are out there, and there are lots of different resins from lots of different manufacturers, and there's more coming out every day, but most of the resins that are out there have a really, really strong odor. One of the reasons that I moved to doing the majority of my priming with an airbrush is because I don't want to use a spray can in the house. The propellant in spray cans has a terrible odor. Some of them are better, some of them are worse, just like in all situations. But if I can't spray outside because it's too cold or windy or rainy or apocalyptic or whatever, then I want to be able to spray in the house. And I can't spray with a rattle can in the house without stinking up the entire house. I've got a wife. She doesn't like the smell. I've got 4 cats. They can't particularly tell me whether they like the smell of the stuff or not, but I don't want to risk their health. I don't want to risk my wife's health. I don't want to risk my own health with that propellant stink. They always tell you in the can, it's super important to well-ventilated area. That's what you see all the time. And so there's no well-ventilated area in our house particularly. So that's why I spray outside when I do have to use a rattle can. And that's why I moved to mostly doing my priming and stuff like that and varnishing with an airbrush, because it doesn't use compressed air or any kind of propellant. Well, it uses compressed air, not a propellant in a can, which smells bad. With resin printers, you're also dealing with a horrible, horrible smell. Most of the resins that I've looked at online have said use in a well-ventilated area. Most resin printers kind of are enclosed like a box, but still that stink gets out, and I don't want that stuff particularly in the house. That's a big deal for me right now. That's a big deal breaker. A lot of people have said, when I've mentioned this in the past, they're just like, oh, just put it in your garage. Well, again, I live in Wisconsin, where putting things that have liquid in them in the garage 6 months of the year is not a good idea. So I don't frankly know if there are optimal operating temperatures for resin printers, but if there are, I'm sure my garage is generally not one of them. So that's also not a really good thing for me. The smell is frankly rough, and that's a big deal. There are newer resins that are coming out that are becoming lower odor, and I'm sure that eventually they'll become very low odor resins, because this is a problem not just for me, but for a lot of folks. If I could figure out a good way to sort of like ventilate the basement in a certain spot where I could do it, that'd be great. But you know, if I save a bunch of money by buying a $250 resin printer or a $500 resin printer, but then I have to spend a whole bunch of money to figure out how to ventilate the basement more efficiently, then I don't know that that comes out in the wash very well. Speaking of the wash, resin printing is very different than filament printing. When you get done with your filament print, you know, from your machine that does with the big spool, you take a putty knife, you pop it off of there. You might have to break off some supports. You might have to sand it a little bit, but you're ready to go, basically. You can start priming on it. You can start doing whatever you want with it. When you're done with a resin print, you have to take the plate that's got the object that's upside down on it. You have to take that out of the machine, and it is dripping with resin. And you're not supposed to get the resin on your hands. So step one is put on, you know, latex gloves, nitrile gloves, whatever your fancy is. And then you have to get it out, and it's going to drip resin all over the place. So you've got to set up like those, I've seen people on YouTube that use those big kind of tinfoil pans that you use for turkeys and stuff like that. And they'll have that in front of there. And then you've got to try to clean the stuff off with isopropyl alcohol, whatever the thing is. You dunk it in there, you know, get it in there, all that stuff. And then once that's clean, hopefully, and it's hopefully clean because it'll be sticky and gross and all that stuff, then you have to cure it in UV light. Now, some people live in a corner of the world where they have plenty of UV light outside, so they set it outside on their porch or whatever, and then boom, you know, half an hour later, they've got a fully cured thing. Other people, where it's cloudy sometimes or whatever, that kind of stuff, we end up using some sort of other kind of UV light. I've seen YouTube channels where they show you how to make your own UV curing thing with UV LEDs. I've seen people use those things that they use at the nail salon, I guess, that for certain types of nails that need to be cured with UV. there are steps. It's not just take it out of the machine and now you got yourself a cool thing. It's now take it out of the machine, don't get goop everywhere. Spoiler alert, you're going to get goop everywhere. And then clean off all the goop, and then you have to cure it so that it doesn't stop, so it stops being goop in general and then for me right now, that's again a bit of a deal breaker. Not only the smell, but also all of that extra goop and all that stuff. Now, I can see them solving the smell problem to some degree with resins going forward in the future. I think the goop problem is going to be a little bit more difficult. For me, frankly, the goop problem is less of a deal breaker. I would have to set up like a kind of a dedicated area. Like it's not something like right now, my filament printer is on one end of my workbench. And I don't mean my hobby workbench, but my like tools workbench down in the basement. And it sits there and does its 3D printing stuff. And I don't have to worry about it when it's running too much. Like I don't have to like make sure I don't, you know, it's not gonna leave stuff all over the place. Resin printers, you need to kind of have a dedicated area for them so that you don't get goop all over the place. They need to be leveled every time. You should level your filament printer as well, but it's maybe not quite as important. Yeah, there's just a lot to it. And so for me right now, I'm looking at it from the aspect of owning a resin printer. I could get one. I just don't need another hobby right now. So I have mainly two hobbies right now. I have wargaming, which includes both the playing and also the building and the painting and all that stuff and everything. The other hobby that I have is this. It's making videos and things like that for YouTube. I don't do enough filament printing to consider that to be a hobby. I do a decent amount here and there, but I also don't try to modify my 3D printer. I see a lot of people online, I've got friends that do this as well. They buy a 3D printer and then they buy different screws for it or different springs or different gears and all kinds of stuff. They overclock it, they put in those lights that go underneath it so it shines up during drag races. They put a spoiler on it, like whatever. And I'm not interested in doing that. Like I want a 3D printer where I push a button and then a print comes out eventually. I don't have to, it doesn't have to happen in minutes. It can take a long time, but I want a print to come out. Now, because we live in an era here in 2019 where you can still barely get paper printers to work properly, at least I can't, I'm not really hoping that it's ever going to become that plug and play where you just go, here's the data that you need, and then out comes a print eventually. Down the road, thousands of years in the future, maybe that'll happen, but maybe they'll get paper printers fixed by then too. Let's see. But my point is that there are people out there who another one of their hobbies is 3D printing, and they modify and tweak and do all that kind of stuff to their printer. My normal filament printer, I calibrate it, and that's pretty much about it. And I may not get the best possible prints ever, but I get prints that I'm pretty happy with for terrain and stuff like that, and that's cool. Resin is, again, a whole kind of another hobby, especially just all of the post-printing kind of cleanup and all that kind of stuff. So I've got too much currently kind of going on in my life that I kind of don't want to go that direction. So even though I've had several of these companies reach out to me and say, hey, we'll send you a free one if you want to talk about it, it's just not been something that's been interesting to me that I've been able to really fit into the amount of time that I've got available on any given day. So am I saying that you should not buy a resin 3D printer? No, not at all. I'm saying that if you're interested in printing very highly detailed, very smooth, small pieces, and small is a relative term. I mean, I don't know that I would do pieces of terrain with it. Maybe scatter terrain, awesome. That would be awesome. Really big pieces of terrain, probably a little bit better on filament, but that's up to you. But I am letting you know that just because the price has dropped dramatically in resin printers over the last 2 years or whatever since I made that video, you should still definitely think about all the other stuff that comes along with it. And I am not particularly qualified to give you all of the rundown. I am giving you, again, kind of the overview. Go do some research online. Go do some research on YouTube. Follow some 3D printing, especially if they're talking about resin 3D printers, follow some of them and see what they're doing and see about all the other stuff that they've got to do to work with these resin prints, and then determine whether the kind of cost and the effort, you know, outweighs the ends or not. Maybe you really, really want to make cool little miniatures and all kinds of neat stuff, and you don't care about the isopropyl alcohol and the UV curing and all that and everything being sticky and all that stuff, and you're fine with that, and you want another hobby. Great, then you should look into that. But the reason, when people ask me why I haven't moved into resin printing right now, it's because of the smell, it's because of the stickiness, and it's because I've already got enough hobbies right now, and if I really need something resin 3D printed, I know a couple of people, and I can probably send it to them and pay them and get them to print something and send it back to me. And if you've got a friend with a resin printer, maybe that's the way you at least want to start and see what you think about the outcome.